It feels like the first question to you after the election result has to be, are you still convinced that Brexit is going to happen?
I think it's possible now that Brexit doesn't happen. I think it's absolutely necessary that it doesn't happen, because I think every day is bringing us fresh evidence that it's doing us damage economically, certainly doing us damage politically. And I think that when people really reflect on why we wanted to do Brexit, or why the country voted for it, then they can see that in respect of the immigration issue, the overwhelming majority of these European migrants who come into our country are people we actually need for various reasons. So I think as this thing goes on, the cost-benefit analysis of leaving becomes very clear. And then the question really is, have we got the political leadership in the country to try and explain to people what the different options are and guide us in a different direction?
So how would it come to a halt then? Would there be another referendum?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because you can obviously, I think public opinion is moving on it. Look, this time last year we were the fastest growing economy in the G7, we're now the slowest. Our savings ratio is at the lowest for 50 years. The investment community internationally has now gone really negative on us. Our currency's down 10, 12%. Investment in the motor car industry, for example, is down 30%. Living standards are stagnating. I mean, this is causing us real damage. That's beyond doubt. So the question is, in circumstances where the party leadership in both main parties is still committed to Brexit, how does it happen? And I think it happens if there is a strong movement for change out in the country that starts to impact on MPs. And how that happens, second referendum, votes in Parliament and so on, I think that, in a sense, you get to that later. The question is, can you get a clear sense from the people in the country that the will that they expressed last June is shifting?
That is the key question. As part of the programme, we're quite keen to go out and talk to people in different parts of the country. And as part of that, I've spoken to voters in places like Boston who feel furious that immigration, they believe, has changed their communities. Barnsley, they feel globalisation has robbed them of a prospect of a stable career. They'll listen to what politicians like you are saying, people that they believe are members of the establishment, and they'll feel pretty angry, won't they?
Well, I think you've got to distinguish the different reasons why people voted for Brexit. I mean, I think there are situations where in particular parts of the country, the influx of European migration has been a problem. It's one of the reasons why we had that whole debate about, could we get a compromise on freedom of movement principles?
And do you take responsibility for that? Because a lot of that happened under your government.
Yeah, but it happened for very good reasons in 2004 in a completely different economic situation. And we can come back and argue about that in a minute, by the way. But in respect of globalization, yes, I think there are real anxieties that people have culturally on immigration, and economically, because they see the world changing around them, and there are communities and people who feel left behind. But the key point is this: Brexit is not the answer. And part of the damage that Brexit does, again, every day, is it distracts us as a country from dealing with what are the real issues of globalization. I mean, if we want to control immigration, by the way, half the immigration comes from outside of Europe. We could control it now. The immigration that comes in from Europe, once you start to break down those numbers, you see that we need the high-skilled people. There are people working in the financial sector or in the technology sector, people working in our health service. We need these people. The lower-paid people, the low-skilled people who come in as seasonal workers, there aren't masses of British people queuing up for these jobs. The companies that employ these people need to employ these people. Students. We want students, foreign students, to come in. It's income for the country, and it also establishes relations with other countries. So when you break down the EU immigration, it turns out, my institute reckons that probably 2/3 of the people that come in are people in any event we actively want to come. So what I would say to people, whether it's in Barnsley or Boston or wherever it is yes, we've got to provide answers to your problems and your challenges, but this is not the answer. This is actually going to distract us from dealing with the real problems of the country, and it's going to make us poorer.
Is it patronising, though, to suggest that you know better than they do what the answer is?
It's not a question of me knowing better. It's a question of having an honest and open exchange of views so that people understand the difference between being part of Europe, for example, in the single market, and being outside of it. And, people say, you're patronising people if you point these things out. I think it's to patronise people to suggest that they won't listen to an argument. And it's not as if the result last June was like sort of 75-25, right? It's 52-48. I think the sensible thing, because now we're seeing what Brexit really means. What does Brexit mean? Okay. As we see that and as the argument develops, if we had the right political leadership, we would be explaining to people the options. So you take, when people say they want a soft Brexit, and even if people, in Parliament, people who really should know about this saying, well, we want a soft Brexit, but we're going to leave the single market. You leave the single market, it's not a soft Brexit. A free trade agreement, which we would have as a third country negotiating with Europe, is not the same as the single market. The single market is a unique construct. It's allowed massive intra-European trade. It was actually a construct initiated by the British under Mrs. Thatcher, carried on by John Major and myself. We benefit from the single market.
You see, you could be talking there about Jeremy Corbyn, who has argued again for leaving the single market and then trying to get the best possible tariff-free access. So you think he's wrong? Well,
I'm talking about anyone who's engaged in this position. If you say you want a jobs-first Brexit, but we're going to leave the single market, it's a contradiction in terms. There isn't a jobs-first Brexit that means taking ourselves out of this unique trading area involving 50% of our trade. And if you add in leaving the customs union at the same time, you're talking about literally having to reshape the trading patterns of this country in a way that no modern developed country has ever been able to do.
Do you think the Labour Party, with its current position of having a jobs-first Brexit, of having the best tariff-free access to the single market, to retain the benefits, is that deliberately deceptive?
No, I don't think it's deliberately deceptive, but I think, for example, when people talk about tariff-free access, which is on the goods side, so you've got goods and services, tariff-free access on goods. Okay, you probably could negotiate that, but it's the non-tariff barriers that are the biggest problem. You're going to have customs checks. You're going to have rules of origin requirements. They're talking about multiplying by 5 times the number of customs checks and border checks we're going to have if we get out of the single market. Think of the cost and the bureaucracy. And on the service side, if you're out of the single market, and by the way, in services, we've got a huge surplus in trade with the European Union. If you're out of the single market, you're not going to get the same terms as you had in the single market unless you actually agreed to abide by all the European rules, in which case you might as well stay in it.
So is Jeremy Corbyn providing an effective opposition then on Brexit?
Well, I think the problem for the Labour leadership, both for Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, is very, very simple. That I think a lot of people supported us at this last election on the basis that voting Labour was a way of stopping Brexit or limiting the mandate of Theresa May on Brexit. And I think if we end up in a position where we're also for carrying forward Brexit and leaving the single market, I think a lot of those people will be saying, well, I voted Labour because I thought I was going to stop these things, and actually the Labour leadership's in favour of them. So, this is, again, a debate that's going to go on the Labour Party, as in the Conservative Party. My bigger anxiety is just what's happening to the country.
So is Labour providing that opposition then?
Well, I think Labour is providing the opposition up to a point, but I would like to see it go further.
The issue is, of course, though, that Labour's position on Brexit seemed to work quite well in that general election. Were you surprised by the result?
Yes, I was surprised by the result. I mean, I think on Labour's position working well in the election, I'm a little dubious on that, but okay, let's accept it for the purpose of argument. But the point is it can't last. I mean, at some point, we are going to have to take a definitive position. Are we in favour of staying in the single market, or which a large part of business and the trade union movement want us to do, or are we in favour of getting out? Now, the reason, by the way, why people hesitate in staying in the single market is that if we agree to stay in the single market, there's a very obvious next step in the argument, isn't there? Because then people say, well, in that case, why are we leaving Europe? But that's precisely why the question of changing Brexit, removing this distraction from our politics, concentrating on the big questions that are coming down the pipe at us, would be the best solution.
I'm keen to talk a bit more about that election result, because it does seem as though you got Jeremy Corbyn pretty much completely wrong. Just to look at some of the things you said about him previously, if Jeremy Corbyn becomes leader, it won't be a defeat like 1983 or 2015 in the next election. It will mean rout, possibly annihilation. You weren't just a bit off there, you were way off.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. So I think this election, by the way, was held in very unique circumstances. I actually think at the beginning of the election campaign, we were going to be routed. I think what happened was as much to do with the Tory campaign as our campaign. However, I say this absolutely up front in the kind of essay I've written. I've got to pay tribute to his temperament during the campaign, to their mobilisation, particularly of younger voters, to the way they fought the campaign, and they've generated a lot of enthusiasm. I completely buy that. What I don't buy is two things. First of all, I think a lot of people voted Labour, not because they thought he was about to be Prime Minister and Labour was about to win, but because they were horrified at the Tory campaign and wanted to put the brakes on it. And secondly, I think there will be significant numbers of people for sure voted for him with enthusiasm. I think there were an awful lot of people who voted for him because they couldn't stomach the Tories and wanted to make a point. And I'm sceptical myself that this is a coalition that's capable of holding, particularly if it becomes clear that we're really in the same position as the Tories on Brexit.
Do you think he'd be a good Prime Minister?
The doubts, I expressed before, I haven't changed my mind on that. I think the problem with that old left programme is that it just doesn't meet the needs of the times. And the danger for the country, and look, it's all I do when I speak on these things is get a great shed load of abuse. So why am I doing it? I'm actually really worried about the country at the moment. I think if you follow up Brexit with a hard left economic programme, this country is going to be in real trouble. And the fact is they aren't solutions. They're two different visions of the 1960s. When this country needs to work out an agenda for the future. You just take one very simple thing, which is the influence of automation, artificial intelligence, big data. This is going to transform the economy. Now, if you take the Germans, they've had this program that they've been running for some time now on the digitalization of industry. And it sounds very sort of, ethereal and who the hell cares. It's going to change their ability to operate in this modern world that technology is revolutionizing. We're not even debating these things. They're not even part of our agenda. How do you redefine a welfare and retirement system and things like social care? But for today's world, we're still debating those in terms of do we spend more money, do we not spend more money? We're nowhere near, in my view, in this country at the moment, articulating an agenda for the future. And that's because we're stuck with one political party that's defined by Brexit and an attitude on immigration that, again, in my view, is just out of date, and the other with an old-style leftist programme, which is, OK, I understand why it generates enthusiasm, but it isn't an answer.
So you think Jeremy Corbyn's agenda is one of the 1960s?
Well, I think it's just, to be fair to Jeremy, he's never changed his position, not since the first time I came across him in the late 70s, early 80s. But it's not an answer to the country's problems.
The thing is, though, in this election, it was Jeremy Corbyn's unashamedly left-wing manifesto that won people over. So surely that was right and you were wrong.
Well, you're absolutely right that it did have an impact. That's true. But unfortunately, it doesn't make the policies right. And, people say to me, well, centrism, the type of centre-left progressive politics that I represent, or the centre-right, that's had its day, it's gone. It wasn't on offer. And I do point out that neither party won a majority. And I still believe that provided the centre becomes the place to advocate change, because people do want change, they need change. In a world that's changing, we have got to change. Provided the centre becomes the place where you can start answering some of these questions, then I think that politics still has tremendous validity and tremendous support in the country. And it's better to provide the answers than just ride the anger.
You talk about populism quite a lot in the article that you wrote about riding the anger. Do you see any similarities between Donald Trump on the right and Jeremy Corbyn on the left?
Well, I think the populism of the left and right is essentially two different they're two different facets of the same phenomenon, which is that people do feel angry, they feel insecure. This generation, I think, does not think that the next generation will do better than them. So that generational promise that's always been at the heart of Western politics is absent. But the fact is, neither's an answer. The answer, sure, we should have controls on immigration. It's important to control immigration. When I was Prime Minister, I fought a whole election campaign around immigration and the need to control it, actually. But being anti-immigrant in today's world, it's ridiculous. It's not, it's not going to improve our country. It's not going to give it a bigger stake in the future. And likewise, you go back down the path of unrestricted spending, nationalisation, more trade union power. Come on, this is the 21st century. So when people say to me, well, these policies are popular, I mean, I guess in the end, what I'm saying is, okay, I'm not sure they're quite as popular as you think they are, but let's assume you're right and they are popular. Doesn't make them correct, I'm afraid.
Now, a little earlier in the interview, you talked about why do you do all this? Because you just get subjected to this torrent of abuse. There's been lots of sort of talk about social media abuse in recent days, and I know you're not on social media, but do you ever read it? Do you ever read any of it? Or is it water off a duck's back?
No, it's never water off a duck's back, because that would make you, frankly, insensitive. But it's not. I think nowadays you just have to be prepared. If you're going to step outside the door, you're going to get a lot of abuse. And I do think, this is a whole other topic for debate, I think there's a huge issue today in how information is traded and exchanged in a democracy. And I think the interaction of conventional media that's become fragmented, much more partisan, with social media, is creating part of this polarization of politics and the sense you've got two bits of the country really not talking to each other at all. I think that's dangerous for democracy long term.
Does your family get affected by some of the abuse you get?
Not particularly. I mean, they're pretty robust because they've lived with it for a long time. But although you're in a situation today where Leo's kind of 17 now, believe it or not, so they've got access to so much stuff, so I guess they can't help read it from time to time, but they seem to manage.
Another politician who's having certainly a bit of a hard time recently is Theresa May. Do you feel any sympathy towards her?
Yeah, I do, of course, because I know what it's like to do the job, and I think it's a very unsatisfactory situation where you've got the Prime Minister surrounded by people who are just waiting for the moment they decide to throw her off the ledge. I mean, I think there's something a little unseemly about all of it, really. And I do feel sorry for her, because I think, she's somebody who has got the best interests of the country at heart. It's just that I profoundly disagree with her about Brexit. I understand why she thinks, look, the people have spoken, my job is to deliver that verdict. But I would just like to see more leadership and less followership.
But you can perhaps empathise with the sharks circling.
Look, when you've done the job, it's a small club of people, right? You've done the job, you realise it's very tough. It's a great privilege to do it, of course. But, you're taking decisions all the time, every day, and you're under enormous pressure. And, yeah, sure, the sharks are always circling.
I'm keen to end by talking a bit about your legacy, because two of the fundamental parts of your legacy are now effectively big unpicked, which is the UK being at the forefront of the EU project and also your reforms to the Labour Party. I mean, have you failed?
Well, I don't know so much whether I've failed. Has opinion moved against those two positions? I'm not sure about that. I mean, one of the things I think is very important right now is to be, aware enough to say, look, politics has taken a turn in these last 2-3 years that I didn't really anticipate. And one thing for me is I'm back almost like a student of politics. I'm studying it and thinking about it and trying to work it out. But I think if Britain carries through Brexit, if we really do this, we are going to diminish ourselves and relegate ourselves as a country. And if we decide to do that, okay, we decide to do it. But I still hope that part of the legacy will will be retrieved, and we understand that in today's world, to separate yourself from the largest commercial market and biggest political union right on your doorstep, in this world where you're going to have China and India and these massive powers emerging, it's just not sensible. So I still think Brexit's work in progress. And as for the Labour Party, look, I still think in the end you win best from the centre and you govern best from the centre, because today's world doesn't really lend itself to ideological solutions. They're much more practical. I was talking a bit about the new technological revolution, how it's going to change the workplace. How you respond to that, okay, is about values. It's about making sure everyone gets access to the best technology you can give. You make sure that people are protected through a process of change. That's where the values matter. But a lot of it's just going to be about understanding the way the world's changing and shaping policy to take advantage of the opportunities and mitigate the risks. So maybe it looks like these two things are, these two parts of my legacy have been damaged, but let's wait and see.
Very optimistic. Another part of your legacy, of course, like it or not, is Iraq. Sir John Chilcot last week said you went straight with the nation. Yeah,
look, because I've learned over time there's no point in trying to relitigate this with people. If you want to know what I received as the information, you can go and read it online. And I think that's what people should do, and then they can make their own judgment.
Just to end, you are someone who always comes across as being remarkably self-assured, very self-confident in your own opinions and beliefs. But it's hard to escape the thought that you've been on the losing argument in most of the big political debates of recent years. Donald Trump, Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn. Does it ever cross your mind and you have that moment of self-doubt and think, maybe I've got all this wrong. Maybe I'm not right on this.
No, first of all, by the way, I've got continual self-doubt, which is what you should have if you're at all sensible about your politics. But I just point out, my politics hasn't been on offer, actually, the last 10 years. I mean, I know it often seems as if...
so you think if it had been, then you'd be on the winning side?
No, what I think is this, that I think that the type of politics that I represented, which was strong commitment to social justice and to social change. I mean, remember we introduced the minimum wage, the Good Friday Agreement, we made massive investments in health and education. When I left office, health service satisfaction ratings were at the highest level for years and years and years. But we were in favour of dynamic business and enterprise, right? I still think that has got real appeal. Now, I agree with you. If you look back over these last years, particularly post the financial crisis, then you can say, look, that politics has had its day, and now what people want is the populism from the left or populism from the right. But then you look at France, and you see the victory of Macron, and you realise it's not as simple as that.
So could that happen in the UK, you think? A new centre-ground party?
Well, I'm not advocating new parties, but could it be that a politician, say, from either of the two main parties who was in that position, could they win? Yeah, they could win. And, one thing people forget is 2 years ago we had a general election in Britain, which David Cameron won pretty much from a centre-right position. So I agree with you. I think, the politics that I represent is definitely under real challenge. The conventional wisdom is at the moment that centrism has had its day and is passé, but I don't really believe that. And in any event, by the way, even if it's what people want to do, it doesn't stop me believing in it and believing it's sensible. And I do think if we end up in British politics, as I say, with these two competing visions of the past, they're visions of the past, they're not of the future, we'll just do damage to ourselves.